The sky had turned the color of a festering bruise, that sickly blend of purple and green that once heralded trouble even before the world was devoured by its own mistakes. Thunderheads broiled at the horizon, flickering with electric blue pulses, particles of radioactive dust igniting in the roiling gusts. People used to call these storms the Aurora Onslaught. But that was before most of those who could name them perished. Now they were simply known as the glowing tempests. Every survivor understood what it meant when the air crackled with unnatural color. Find shelter, bolt down everything you can, or witness a sight so impossible it nearly bordered on the divine. A tornado of lambent light twisting across the plains, devouring all in its path. From the broken windows of the old train depot, Barrick peered out into that swirling darkness. He felt the hairs on his arms stand in static tension. The stench of ozone invaded his nostrils, enough to make him lightheaded, yet he refused to move. Instead, he pressed his palm against the cracked glass and watched. The station had become his vantage point for the past 3 days, ever since he'd stumbled upon this lonely town that used to be a passing stop along a once bustling railroad. A wave of memories gnawed at him, of an era when people shouted over the locomotive whistles as they boarded trains to distant cities, unafraid of rainstorms or meltdown skies. But in the present, the only sound was a distant rumble of thunder. A dull glow overcame the horizon. Varek swallowed, his throat tight. He'd seen the phenomenon before. Swirling funnels of acrid wind, tinted by luminous dust that had been charged by residual radiation. It was an ominous spectacle, like some cosmic dancers had descended from the sky to twist in reckless fury. The storms had arrived before, and they always carried destruction. But to behold what came next, the so-called light tornadoes, was a reminder of how twisted Earth had become. The funnel would crackle and blaze like a neon vortex, beautiful enough to draw the unsuspecting to a scenic vantage, only for them to be rendered into ash and rags once the funnel fell upon them. In the weeks that followed, survivors found pyroclastic debris and melted footprints, evidence of people who had stood too close. Barek tore himself away from the window. He needed a plan. That was all he ever had these days. Food was scarce. Radiation was abundant, creeping in through the smallest drafts. His dusty brown coat still offered some protection, a relic from the old times, lined with an anti-rad mesh. He remembered purchasing it from an eccentric merchant who had claimed to have scavenged it from a military depot. Barrick had scoffed then, but he had paid dearly for it, and now it was probably the only thing standing between him and a slow death in the wilderness. A faint pang of hunger gnawed at his belly. That was the other problem. He reached inside his satchel for a ration bar, half crumbled and chalky, tasting of cardboard and regret. He winced as he chewed. Outside, as twilight pressed in, the entire horizon seemed to warp with unearthly color. Barrick heard the wind picking up, howling through the open doorways across the street, rattling splintered boards. The boardwalk in front of the train depot no longer looked stable. The floorboards bowed as if they were about to snap. He knew he couldn't remain there much longer. If the tornado came this way, it would tear the place apart. The train tracks, corroded and rusted, had parted in places, so no train was coming to rescue anyone. Barrick thrust the ration bar into his mouth, took one more swallow, and started filling his pockets with any leftover supplies he found in the desk drawers: pencils, paper scraps, a flashlight that flickered with a faint glow, and an ancient radio that hadn't worked in months. The radio was worthless, but he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. It reminded him of days when transmissions still traveled the airwaves, carrying voices of hope. He stepped onto the station platform, and the wind whipped his hair into his eyes. He caught a glimpse of a small bunker toward the eastern edge of town, maybe someone's personal shelter from the old nuclear scare. Some families in this region had built underground bunkers, anticipating a cataclysm that eventually arrived in a form more horrific than they could have ever guessed. If that shelter was intact, perhaps he could ride out the storm there. Barrick tugged at the collar of his coat, hunched his shoulders, and picked his way carefully across the dusty tracks. Splinters and shards of broken glass lay about, remnants from the windows that had shattered in previous storms. He had to watch his footing. Twisting an ankle out here could be fatal. Up above, lightning arced in unnatural colors, shimmering along the swirling gray clouds. He heard footsteps. Instantly, Barrick froze, heartbeat throbbing in his ears. Most of the survivors he encountered never sought company, let alone offered kindness. After everything the planet had endured, trust had become a rare luxury. He pressed himself against a crumbling wall, scanning the gloom. The footsteps were deliberate but hesitant. They sounded like they belonged to a smaller figure, one who was trying and failing to tread lightly. A faint silhouette emerged from behind an overturned truck. Barrick slid his hand onto the hilt of his makeshift dagger, but he didn't move. He watched. The figure paused, turned, and let out a small gasp upon spotting him. It was a young woman, thin as a rail, hair tied haphazardly in a strip of cloth. She carried a small satchel slung over her shoulder. You're alive, she said, her voice breathy with fear and something like relief. She didn't appear armed, though in this ruined world, looks could be deceiving. Her eyes darted from Barrick's face to the swirl of storm clouds overhead. He loosened his grip on the dagger. Yes, he replied simply. You on your own? She took a moment to glance behind her as if expecting someone else to step forward, but no one did. I've been traveling for days, she said quietly. The storms. I was told the path south might be safer, but I got caught. He studied the horizon again, searching the clouds. The storm was close, and the luminous funnel was forming, a shimmering vertical column that grew from the ground up, swirling with radioactive dust. It was still miles away, but it looked hungry. I'm heading for that bunker, he said, nodding to the old ridge behind the cluster of broken buildings. Might be safer underground. Several moments of hesitation passed, then she nodded. We can help each other, she said, voice trembling. The wind's so strong, might be good to have someone around. My name's Honora. Her name struck a chord in him. Simple, unassuming, yet it tethered him to a small piece of normalcy. He extended his free hand. Barrick. The meeting took only seconds, but desperation forged bonds quickly in these times. Together, they slid along the side of the debris-littered street, the wind screeching overhead. Street lamps, which had once lined the boulevard, were now bent in half or snapped off. Honora clutched onto Barrick's arm as they navigated. They both flinched at each flicker of lightning. A brilliant glow behind them illuminated the surroundings like sunrise at midnight. The funnel was closer. Across the sky, arcs of light danced. The radioactive dust coated the tornado in a ghostly phosphorescence, and it looked almost alive, swirling like a wrathful serpent. Every so often, Barrick thought he glimpsed flickers of shapes inside the vortex, as though the ghosts of the dead roamed within, carried on the blazing winds. They reached the bunker's entrance, a steel door half buried under debris. Barrick bent down and wiped away layers of sand and ash. The handle squeaked under his grip, fighting him all the way. He tested the hinges. They moaned with rust, but relented a fraction. Honora grasped a short pry bar from her satchel, passing it to him. He wedged it between the frame and the door, tugging until the metal shrieked, then gave way. A cloud of musty air blew out at them, heavy with the scent of stale confinement and mold. They coughed and choked, pressing sleeves to their faces, but the door stood open. They had a way inside. The interior was pitch black. Barrick flicked on his battered flashlight. The beam wavered over a narrow staircase leading down. A blanket of dust covered every surface, drifting lazily in the air currents, stirred by their presence. The steps were concrete, chipped in places. Honora went first, reaching down to test each step's stability. Barrick followed, shining the light along the walls. Yellowed posters from an older era clung in tatters. Instructions for a nuclear emergency, praising the safety of these shelters and urging people to store enough supplies to outlast fallout. The irony that the apocalypse arrived in a manner even more horrifying than metaphorical bombs had not been lost on anyone who still remembered the old world. At the bottom of the steps, they found a narrow corridor that opened into a cramped living space with a small cot, a rusted metal cabinet, and a table with chairs scattered about. It looked ransacked, likely looted ages ago. Honora set her bag down slowly, taking in the surroundings. Better than nothing, she murmured. She tested the cot. It wobbled, but it didn't collapse. Hortense Barrick tugged on the overhead light cord, half expecting nothing. He was surprised when a faint flicker danced across the bulb. Then it dimmed, possibly a near-dead battery or a generator that was on its last breath. Still, any power left was a gift. He and Honora glanced at each other. By unspoken agreement, they switched the overhead bulb off again to conserve what little energy might remain, though neither believed it would do much good in the long run. They set to investigating the shelves and cabinets. Most compartments stood empty, though Barrick discovered a few cans of beans and soup. The cans bore brand names that nobody manufactured anymore, but they were sealed, so hopefully still edible. Honora found a half-lit canteen in a hidden corner, along with a tattered leather journal. She lifted the cover gingerly to discover pages soaked through by time. A handful of lines remained faintly legible. Storm. Can't see. The light. The rest was smeared beyond recognition. Thunder shook the bunker's foundations. They both paused, listening to the wind rage above. It was an inhuman howl, accompanied by the hiss of airborne debris scraping over the bunker's exterior. The horrifying shriek of the storm made them feel as if the entire structure might be ripped out of the ground. Barrick considered whether the steel door and thick concrete could shield them if the tornado's funnel hammered directly above. Radioactive dust could still leak through cracks, but there was nowhere else they could go. "We just wait," he said almost to himself. Honora nodded, exhaustion sagging her shoulders. Wordlessly, they opened a can of beans. It tasted stale, but each swallow fueled them with precious calories. They offered little conversation at first. Each was wrestling with the fear that the swirling vortex might tear open the bunker or bury them alive under a mountain of rubble. The howling wind rose in pitch, and they switched off the flashlight, not wanting to see dust drifting in with each rumble of thunder. The walls rattled, floors trembled, and for a moment the door upstairs seemed to creak beneath the frenzied onslaught. They could almost imagine the swirling swirl of luminous dust outside, dancing in fury. Time lost meaning as the storm raged on. Minutes and hours blurred together. Barrick's mind drifted to thoughts of old acquaintances. So many had succumbed to these storms since the meltdown of the environment. Factories and power plants had leaked their deadly cargo into the atmosphere, fueling weather patterns that no scientist ever dreamed possible. Instead of a single ground zero, everything had become ground zero. He tried to recall the laughter of friends, the warmth of gatherings, but all those memories felt as distorted as the horizon in the storms. Periodically he felt Honora's hand on his arm, anchoring him to the present. At some point, the shriek above lessened to a low roar, then receded altogether. A stillness replaced it, tinged with the faint drip of water somewhere in the bunker's corner. Barrick and Honora exchanged glances. Silence after a storm was often eerie, but it could mean the funnel had passed. Cautiously they ascended the stairs, unsealing the door. Outside, the town lay in a quasi-lunar landscape. Thick dust coated everything. A strange luminescence hung in the air, causing the ruins to shimmer greenish white. Where the tornado had crossed, a wide swath of devastation ripped across the outskirts, flattening buildings like crushed cans. A train depot was gone, likely scattered across the fields. The ground still crackled with faint static. On the horizon, they spotted the glowing funnel far in the distance, traveling with fierce momentum. Spouts of shimmering light branched off from it, reminiscent of tentacles. Barrick shivered despite himself. The destruction was mesmerizing from this vantage, as if witnessing a cosmic phenomenon that defied logic. But the residue of the storm was just as dangerous. They knew from experience that the air would remain tainted. A Geiger counter would be screeching uncontrollably if either had one. Unfortunately, neither did. In the wake of the destruction, the only direction that promised any semblance of hope was south, away from the still roiling funnel. Honora and Barrick agreed by silent consensus to move on. Traveling under a daylight that remained half-shrouded by radioactive haze, they made their way across the ghost town. Splintered boards and twisted metal jutted out at sharp angles. They passed the husk of a library, or what used to be one. Its walls caved in. Pages from destroyed books blew through the streets. Honora paused to pick up a fragment of a children's story. the illustrations reduced to ghostly lines. She slipped it into her satchel and continued without a word. The roads out of town were in rough shape. Once paved streets were choked with rubble and upturned asphalt. They trekked with caution, occasionally spotting lumps of melted debris. These lumps often had frighteningly recognizable shapes, the remnants of cars, or sometimes the vague suggestion of a human figure caught in the funnel's path. Beric and Honora turned their eyes away if they could. One did not dwell on such things if one wanted to keep moving. As they neared the open plains, the ground turned to cracked earth scattered with patches of dead grass. The wind had calmed to a faint moan. In the distance, they saw more swirling dust devils, smaller cousins to the luminous tornadoes skitter across the fields. They made certain to circumvent them, though occasionally they caught glimpses of shimmering sparks dancing along these gusts, reminding them that radiation was everywhere. They came upon a collapsed ranch house beside a narrow creek. The roof had caved, but sections of the walls stood upright. It was vulnerable to storms, but for the moment, it provided respite from the relentless wind. Honora managed to salvage some planks to start a small fire. They stacked a few broken stones to form a makeshift pit in a corner, sheltered from the wind. With a single match from Berek's tin box, they lit the wood, the flickering flames reaching hungrily upwards. The light was comforting, a reminder that they could still push back the darkness. They ate, splitting another can of soup, warming it in the can itself over the flames. It helped chase away the chill that had settled in their bones. Eventually, Honora spoke. "Before everything fell apart, I lived near the southern coast. My father was a fisherman. At least, that's what he said. We left before the waters turned toxic. He never came back from one of his trips." Beric stared at the fire, listening to the crackle. "I was a farmhand," he offered quietly. "Sometimes the storms would sweep across the fields, but they were nothing like these, just normal tornadoes that caused havoc." His expression hardened. "That was right before the meltdown, right before everything went color crazy." The hush of night settled around them. Stars, once vibrant, were now difficult to see through the atmospheric haze. Even the moon's glow looked anemic, struggling to penetrate the layers of dust. They decided to take turns keeping watch. Beric volunteered first shift. Honora, after a brief protest, lay down on a patch of floor and drifted into an uneasy sleep. Beric listened to her breathing and tried to keep his mind focused on the wind's patterns, scanning the edges of the sky for that dreaded glow. He sat foreboding among the charred rafters, eyes fixed on the horizon. The hours crawled. Not long before dawn, a faint rumble pricked his ears. He stood, stepping out from under the ruined house to watch the horizon. There, miles away, purple-black clouds gathered again, laced with that all-too-familiar radioactive gleam. His heart sank. The storms were fiercer, more frequent. Sometimes a funnel formed, sometimes it did not, but the threat was enough. He returned to wake Honora. "We need to move," he said, voice low. Another system's rolling in. She blinked sleep from her eyes, pushing herself upright. "Already? The weather patterns are all messed up." He gave her a brisk nod. "Let's go." They trudged on at sunrise, leaving the partial shelter behind. Daylight brought little warmth. Clouds smoldered overhead, swirling with a sickly hue. Whenever they saw a swirl or flicker of bright dust, they steered clear. Their approach took them across rolling hills dotted with scraggly brush. Eventually they smelled the ocean, or what passed for one these days. A briny tang carried on the breeze that mingled with the stench of rotting seaweed and chemical undertones. The coastline was only a day's travel away now, if their mapless sense of direction held any accuracy. They passed the remains of an old silo, possibly a relic from the days of basic farmland. Its structure had caved on one side, revealing a curve of rusted interior. The top stood precariously. Beric scouted ahead and discovered another bunker near the silo, or some form of underground shelter. This one's door was half torn off, as if a monstrous wind had pried it open. For a moment, the pair debated whether to risk entering. If other survivors had beaten them there, it could be trouble. If not, maybe it was deserted with scraps of supplies. Eventually they ventured inside. This time the space was smaller, a single cramped room littered with broken crates. It smelled damp and forlorn. Barrick found a single can of peaches beneath some debris, the label half peeled, but the top intact. He held it up with a grin, and Honora's eyes lit with relief. Fresh fruit, or at least something sweet, was a rare delight. She stowed it away. They paused to rest for a few minutes, deciding it wasn't worth staying longer, as signs suggested the partial door wouldn't offer lasting protection. Something had definitely battered its interior. They left and continued on. The second storm was already catching up. Overhead, the sky churned. They walked fast, ignoring the pleas of tired muscles. Occasionally, Barek threw a glance over his shoulder. The thunderheads loomed, black-green with glowing edges, lines of lightning crackling within. It would be only too easy for one of those funnels to form and charge across the plains again. The air had that electric tang that foreshadowed disaster. Honora was the first to spot the drift of structures near the coast. Through the haze, the outlines of a few half-collapsed buildings rose from behind a ridge, presumably an old seaside town or fishing settlement. Hope kindled in them. Along the water's edge, they might find a boat or a safe vantage from which to continue south. The swirling storms seemed more common inland, at least from traveler rumors. Still, the ocean itself wasn't safe. Radioactive algae blooms glowed in the shallows some nights, and the beaches were often littered with toxic flotsam. Yet the prospect of even a fractionally safer route spurred them forward. They reached the outskirts of the coastal settlement just as the wind picked up again. Rusted street signs were bent double. Sand had piled high in some places. A single stone church still stood, its spire chipped but intact. The rest of the town was barely recognizable, with boarded windows and doors torn from their hinges. The ocean spread out beyond, an expanse the color of tarnished silver, with faint green luminescence riding the waves. Whitecaps glowed with an unsettling radiance. Before they could assess further, thunder boomed. Barrick and Honora locked eyes, then ran for the stone church. They found the main doors, which were miraculously shut. Barrick gave them a pull. The hinges protested, but the doors gave way just enough to let them slip inside. A swirl of dust accompanied them, and the darkness within was profound. They stepped carefully, using the flashlight's meager beam to navigate. Rows of pews lay splintered, some piled against walls. The stained glass windows had long since shattered, but the structure still had a roof and walls thick enough to endure a storm. They ventured deeper, past the toppled pulpit. A faint humming, reminiscent of a generator, tickled their ears. They followed the noise to a side room that must have served as an office or vestry. There, in an alcove, they discovered the source, a small, old generator rigged to a battered solar panel outside. It seemed to be whirring in futility, as if trying to charge something in the gloom. The machine gave off a dim glow from a single flickering diode. Next to it was what might have once been a radio transmitter, though it looked severely damaged. Barrick's heart skipped a beat. If it still worked, even partially, they might be able to listen for signals, or at least generate some light. He studied the contraption with trembling hands. Most of the wires were frayed. The antenna snapped. Honora offered her flashlight so Barrick could see better. He tried flipping a switch. At first nothing happened. Then a faint crackle emitted from the device. It was just static. He adjusted the few remaining knobs, heart pounding. Still static, occasionally hissed by a pop of interference. Then, for a moment, there was a flicker of sound, maybe a snippet of a voice, before it vanished into the void. He met Honora's eyes. Even that faint scrap felt miraculous. There were other people out there fighting to stay alive in this ravaged world. If they could fix the radio, maybe they could reach them. But the swirling storms and nuclear-charged atmosphere made consistent communication nearly impossible. Lightning flared through a gap in the wall, momentarily illuminating the entire church with a bright strobe. The storm had arrived, swirling in from the sea. Salt-laden rain pinged against the stone. The wind gusted, howling through cracks. Barrick rushed to check the door, fighting against the pressure of air that sought to fling it open. Honora turned off her flashlight, comprehending that the flickering generator might offer them limited power, They had no illusions that this was guaranteed safety, but at least it was sanctuary enough to avoid the immediate buffeting of the supernatural tempest outside. They retreated into the deeper recesses of the church, finding a small corridor with a storeroom. Inside were a few supplies likely left behind, bottled water, though heavily dust-coated, and a half-broken first aid kit. Barrick rummaged through it. Most of the items had expired, but the bandages looked usable. Honora discovered some old cloth robes, which might serve as blankets. Outside, thunder hammered overhead, accompanied by that low roar they recognized so well. A swirling funnel had likely formed. They could almost picture the ghostly tornado raging near the coastline, dredging up phosphorescent waves and carrying them into the sky in a dazzling, disastrous display. The stone walls shook, dust showering down from the rafters. They huddled in the storeroom, braced for the worst, wondering if at any moment the funnel would tear the roof off. Yet the structure held. After an eternity, the roar faded to the rhythmic pounding of heavy rain. Wind still rattled the doors, but not with the same frenzied intensity. Slowly, carefully, they emerged. Water gushed through cracks in the wall, forming rivulets that spread across the floor. Flickers of greenish lightning illuminated the battered interior. Honora approached the shattered remains of a window, gazing past the broken glass. There, over the ocean, she could see the tornado swirling, just a faint silhouette of luminescent dust now, its funnel dancing across the waters like an illuminated specter. Debris spun in its vortex. For a moment, Barrick stood beside her, and they observed the storm in silence. Despite the destruction it represented, the spectacle was undeniably mesmerizing. It was a twisted reflection of nature's raw power, infused with the lethal mistakes that humankind had unleashed upon the planet. It was both beautiful and horrifying. After the storm finally moved on, the seas calmed slightly, still glowing in places. Barrick opened the side door to the battered courtyard, inhaling the acrid, salted air. The clouds were parting enough to reveal a sliver of the wan morning sun. On the muddied street, rivulets of water carried swirling flecks of debris and radioactive silt. Any attempt to travel onward would involve stepping through that toxic sludge. Yet they had made it through another storm, another day, another chance to survive. They returned to the vestry where the generator hummed faintly, rummaging through the cables again. If they could restore power to the radio, maybe they'd find other survivors who knew a safe route, or a place with stable weather patterns. Barrick carefully twisted together some frayed wires, occasionally catching faint static from the device. Honora assisted by holding a small lamp that flickered from the minimal electricity. Each spark of static reminded them they were not alone in this world, that somewhere out there people struggled against the same horrors. Radioactive storms, luminous tornadoes, a brutal environment that turned once prosperous towns into ghostly wastelands. Eventually, the radio sputtered out a garbled voice, so faint it was nearly lost in the hiss. Barrick froze, adjusting the knob. Words were indistinct, but it sounded like someone urging travelers southward, to a rumored refuge beyond the contaminated waters. They strained to hear the message, hearts pounding with wavering hope. Then the signal dissolved into static again, leaving them with little more than the seed of possibility. Honora slumped back, tears glistening in her eyes. Tears of exhaustion and maybe even relief. "We're going to keep moving," she said quietly, as if practicing the statement. "There has to be a place beyond all of this." Barrick switched off the device, nodding to conserve the generator's power. The faint glow died, returning them to twilight gloom. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though he had no comforting words to speak. Outside, the wind continued to scour the streets, but the skies were momentarily quiet. The next storm would come, no doubt about that. If it wasn't one of the glowing tornadoes, then perhaps it would be another radioactive gale, or a rain of acid that scorched the soil. But for now, they had arisen on the far side of a harrowing night. Barrick motioned to the door. "We wait for the water to recede, then make a run along the shoreline. Follow it south. If that radio voice was real, maybe there's a chance." Aurora nodded, a flicker of determination shining through her fatigue. It was a fragile plan, contingent on a glimmer of static. Still, In a world ravaged by luminous funnels and swirling storms, hungry for the remnants of civilization, a shard of hope was all one could cling to. They gathered their sparse belongings, preparing to venture back into the unknown. In unspoken unison, they stepped out into the watery gray light, leaving footprints in the wet sand that quickly filled with radioactive water. The horizon remained stained with bruised clouds, but for this moment, they were alive and ready to keep going. And sometimes that had to be enough.